is Oromo Voice Radio English program.
Welcome to Oromia Insight. My name is Ali Galato. Today I will present to you Professor Ezekiel-Gebissa speech on OSA 2016 conference.
My topic is the plan and the protests, exploration of the political context. All right. By way of introduction, I just wanted to say that the goal of this conference is not simply to explain or hold a conference today. There will be a product, a book or a journal or something that would disseminate what we're doing there. So this political context is meant for the book to provide the political context that gave rise to both the plan and the protests. So the massive protest in Oromia region that broke out in 2015, in the last months of 2015, marked a turning point in the Oromo national struggle for self-determination. Now, to those who always cast doubt that the Oromo belonged to one nation, those who denied the existence of the Oromo nationalism altogether and dismissed the Oromo's capacity to mount an organized protest against oppression, the protests proved that the Oromo is one nation, unified for a common purpose and a common national identity, and able to pursue their goals through a sophisticated civil action against a heavily armed military. If anything, the Oromo people's actions have shown that Oromia is the epicenter of the struggle against the totalitarian rule that had been imposed, and the protests have earned respect for the young generation of Oromo activists and reaffirmed the observation that two French observers made about a century or more than a century ago, Marshal de Salviac and Anton Dabadie, saying that the Oromo is a great African nation. Now, what was already achieved, what has already been achieved as a result of the protest movement bodes well for the challenge of the future. Now, as citizens of Oromia, we members of the Oromo Studies Association are awestruck by the heroism that the people have shown and humbled by the sacrifices they paid. But as scholars, we owe it to them to document, to explain, and to interpret both the protests and the problems that triggered them. It is true that the protests were triggered by the Addis Ababa Integrated Master Plan and the whole land lease policy of the Ethiopian government that allowed for the eviction of farmers and transferring of smallholder arable land to private investors. It would nevertheless be, as just Henok said, it would be a mistake to reduce the protests, the massive protest, the historic protest, to a resistance against city expansion and urban planning. The master plan triggered, there's no doubt about that, triggered the protest, but the issues are structural. And the protests reveal a crisis of a regime, or a crisis in a regime. And this is what, if we have time, we would be able to show that the protests were triggered by the Addis Ababa Master Plan, but they address a larger issue, very large issue that is really going back to the formation of Ethiopia itself, and particularly the formation of the EPRDF regime since 1991. It goes back at least 20 years. So let me say that how my paper itself is structured. The first one is it addresses briefly, ever so briefly, how the master plan was a trigger. And I would not repeat what Henok said. But I would say that the Oromo national movement has always, the demand for the Oromo national movement had been three things. That is the question of land, language, and I would say leadership, but what I mean by that is self-rule. These are the three demands of the Oromo national movement since its inception in the 1960s. Now, I want to say something about the land question, that the land question has two parts. One is the question about homestead, the K, the livelihood. The other is the Biya. The other is the Biya Oromo or the Biya Gosa Oromo, whatever they are. So there are two goals when they say land. The language issue has been always about identity, the Oromo identity, at least one basis for Oromo identity. It's the foundation of Oromo identity. The struggle against imperial rule and the Derg regime was always about self-rule. So the Oromo struggle, the Oromo national movement has always been about three things: land, language, and leadership, self-rule that is. The questions were raised in the Ethiopian student movement as a question of land to the tiller, and also the question of nationalities. And members of the Oromo nation, who were also members of the Ethiopian student movement, and when I say that, I go back to people like Gabayo Ferrisa, who actually started the movement, the Ethiopian student movement, in the 1970s, and the formation became the leaders of the Oromo Liberation Front in the 1960s, and the Oromo Liberation Front actually articulated these demands in a coherent, programmatic way in the 1970s. And these demands were answered, I would say, piecemeal in different times. And just for the sake of time, I would say the 1974 revolution answered the land question as a question of plots, homestead, returning land to individual Oromos and others in plots. But the question of land as a matter of biya nurra fu'atami, as a matter of biya, was actually rendered a treasonable crime under the 1974 revolution. As you know, the 1974 revolution also responded to the question of language by allowing certain media exposure. But the question of Kube, the use of Kube, was a treasonable crime, as we know. And if Professor Talahongamta is here, he would probably tell a story about that. The 1991 revolution went much further. It actually answered the question of biya, the question of not only land as homestead, but land as homeland. Oromia was created. The Afan Oromo became the Kobe script, the written form of the Oromo language, that it really went further. And self-rule in Oromia, albeit a symbolic form, the Chaffe Oromia was the legislative body where actually Oromos were ruled. Albeit symbolic, it was important. The 1991 revolution went further than the 1974 revolution. By so doing, it laid the foundation for Oromo identity, for Oromo unity, for Oromo statehood in whatever form. And the struggle for national liberation advanced onto a qualitatively different phase. All of this represented hope for the Oromo, that the very question that started the national movement, the very three questions, would now be addressed. Hope was raised. Expectations were raised. But progressively, as the rule of the EPRDF unfolded, what it represented was the reversal of the gains that were made. And the master plan actually represented that very reversal in a real and symbolic way. So in that sense, it's in that sense that I would say the master plan was a trigger. And I want to say, in addition to what Henok said about that it was represented land confiscation, massive land confiscation since arguably Menelik's conquest. That's one thing. The impact is absolutely clear. That is, the master plan was seen as an attempt to change the linguistic and demographic character of the land that they proposed to occupy. And thirdly, the annexation of Addis Ababa, or into Addis Ababa, of 1.1 million hectares, 36 towns, 17 districts. The master plan was simply seen by Oromos as a scheme to destroy. And this is, I'm talking just how people perceive it, as a scheme to destroy the Oromo, Ilman Oromo, and the Biya Oromo. It was seen really as a dagger aimed at what it means to be Oromo. It was seen as a pincer that was meant to destroy Oromo identity altogether, Oromo statehood altogether. It was seen symbolically, that is to say, as a plan to eradicate the presence of Oromo in the central region of Oromia. Here is the point that I really want to add to what everybody says. If I wanted to make any point, this is the one point that I really want to emphasize, and I'm aware that I will be cut off at some point in time. This is the fourth one, which is really important. The master plan symbolized the grand scheme to drive the Oromo out of Finfinne, which has deep-rooted historical significance for the Oromo. And to illustrate what I mean, I would use two examples. In 2003, when the seat of the Oromia government was removed from Finfinne and was relocated in Adama, I was traveling from Finfinne to Leka. And I say Leka because the person that I was talking to was saying, we are going to Leka. We're going to Nakamte, but he says Leka. And I said, and he said to me, are you coming from the heart of Finfinne? Ati handura Oromiati ufta. And I said to him, well, Handura Oromia is no longer Handura Oromia because it has been relocated. And he said, no, lucky. Handuri Oromia in Gedaramu Teso Motumatu Gedarame Male, Handura Geruma, Enyule Gedarundando. So no government, no legislation in the eye of the Oromo can change the center and the heart of Oromia. They could put their party, OPDO, here, there, where, but the heart of Oromia cannot be changed. Any attempt to change that the reaction to that would be visceral. That's what happened here. Now, that's the first question. The second is, and surprisingly, what this man traveling from Addis Ababa to Finfinne to Nakamte was telling me is actually the same sentiment is deeply ingrained in Borana traditions. In the Borana Argat Ageti, as they say it. Here is what they say regarding Finfinne. And this is handed down through generations in Borana Argat Ageti. And what they say is, here is what I say. Ayannike walla, ilmanke salbani, horrike Finfinne. Which means, your origin is one. That is to say, Ayannike walla. Ilmanke salbani, your offsprings are three. That is the Uma, the Umama, and the Nama. And the third one is Horrike Finfinne. It could mean two things. It could mean the salt water, but it also could mean that Horrike Finfinne, that you multiplied. Your harvest is here, brought here. Your products are brought here. And what does that mean if you look deeply into it? Finfinne was not a reference to the spa. Finfinne was not a reference to the Filwuha. As we say, it's not about the water going like fin. What it was that in Borona Argat Ageti, centuries ago, the Galma of the Abamuda was located to the east of the present-day Spa, known as the Filwuha, which today is the site of the Jubilee Palace. That was where the Galma Abagada was, Galma Abamuda was. In Borona memory, the site was the place where the unity of the Oromo was expressed because the Jilla that represented every Oromo Gosa came there. They came there with their finna. They brought their gift to the Abamuda, to that very site, to where Haile Selassie built the Jubilee Palace. In the 1950s, the Abagada of Borana was summoned to Haile Selassie's palace. Madda, I forgot his name, Madda is his name, the Abagada of that time. He was invited there, and Haile Selassie was telling him to tell his people a certain thing, but I'll forget about that because you can read it in one of the Journal of Oromo Studies if you really want to pursue this thing. But Madda Galma told Haile Selassie that this place where you have your palace was the Abamuda's Galma. So the Jilla bring their finna to that site. Finna finne to the Galmas. But this is the site of where the Oromo expressed their unity, because all Jillas of every imaginable Gosa of Oromo came to that site. And this is what explains this visceral reaction of the Oromos to the idea that, to the students, the Oromo and people, the idea that the Oromo will not have access to this sacred site and they'll be cut off by the master plan. It's in this way that it is really the and by the way, the Arbora or the federation, the confederation of the Aboti Gadas, They actually asked. The site, those of you who know Finfinne know this, the site to the west is an open land still today, right in front of the hospital. They requested the government to make that site, that sacred place, the place where they would celebrate the Irecha. That was denied. I'm sure I did call someone yesterday on the phone when he was singing that Namagarat Ame Dirmamu Nargani. Is Hachalu here? Yes. Yeah. Namagarat Ane Dirmamu Nargani, when he means is that's where you're hit. When you're hit there, you would not see, everybody else who is non-Oromo will not be able to see how hurtful it is to be hit in that place by Finfinne. Okay, so that is the point about the trigger. That's how it triggered. That's what explains the visceral reaction of the Oromo. That's what explains that the Oromo from east to west, north to south, they stood up as one people because they were hit on the stomach. That was the symbolic idea. And as I said, I will not go into the structural at this point for saving the time because there will be a book. We should not reduce the protest to a reaction to the master plan. There are political, economic, constitutional, administrative, federal. But in general, I want to say something about a concept that is important for us to really understand. That concept is what is known as the rule of violence, which a concept developed by Gammachuu Magarsa and Anisa Kassam, which really captures the long-standing grievances of the Oromo people. The concept refers to a distinct feature of governance in Ethiopia in which the governing class, the governing elite, crosses the boundary, violates a boundary, and simply constrict the space where people could even talk to each other. So the violence is political, the violence is economic, the violence is cultural, the violence is even epistemological. We couldn't even write our own history. That is what the rule of violence is. And the Oromo people rose against the rule of violence, demanding the rule of law. So it's structural in that sense. But because I spoke about the master plan, I really want to say a couple of things about the protest as well. This is how the master plan was. It triggered, but I will not talk about the structural aspect because of time. But let me say a couple of things about protests. The protests should not be seen as an isolated event. The protests of 2015 are a culmination of a steadily rising resistance against the rule of violence, which started, as I was saying earlier, with the Tigray People's Liberation Front rule in Ethiopia and the displacement of a genuine political representation of the Oromo in the political sphere. It started, that is to say, the seeds of the problem were planted with the OLF and other Oromo organizations being removed from the political scene, being driven out of participation in the traditional life. What they are harvesting today is what they planted then. When they removed genuine representation, that's where the source is. Since then, Oromo resistance has manifested itself in different ways. I think Makurea will talk about that sequence, so I don't want to take that space from him. But it was manifested in different ways, specifically with the resistance against the relocation of the Oromo capital to Adama. The present protests were first expressed in May 2014, when the very existence of a master plan was presented to the OPDO, and OPDO members resisted it. And the deputy mayor of Addis Ababa confidently declared the master plan will be implemented, and the arrogance and the outright contempt that he showed for the Oromo people was the fuel, the underbrush that provided the fuel for the already simmering political tensions since the 2003 resistance to the relocation of Oromia capital. And then, I mean, this is what we own. Between the 2014 and 2015, a number of things happened. The protests were calmed down because of the promise that the master plan would be shelved. The government did so because there was an election coming in front of them in 2015. They promised that they will shelve it or fold it, but after the 2015 government elections, and the braggadocio started to come out where Mr. Abai Sahaye convened about 1,000 engineers and urban planners and told them that it will be implemented. Okay? It's not only that they were saying it, but the contempt that they had for the experts was just as what we have seen. And this is really what started it. And after the election, they not only came back to the master plan, but also said there will be another proclamation, which they called it the Oromia Towns Reform Proclamation in Oromia. Now, so this is not just about the grievances of the story. These were the grievances. But the story is also about rising political consciousness and the coming of age of another generation of Oromos that grew up at least in the last 20 years. What do I want to say that? I just want to pay homage to the artists, because there is a lot we can say, but I just want to say something about the place of the artists. The intellectuals had made changes, but I really want to say something about how the artists actually, the new generation of Oromos, adopted cultural tactics, cultural devices to express their grievances. In Oromia itself, the flourishing of Oromo literature is not simply a sign of tremendous cultural revival, but a niche which the Oromo appropriated for consciousness raising, for organizing, and for mobilizing protests. How did they do that? A decade ago, when the seat of Oromia was relocated and no level of political hierarchy would listen to the Oromo, beginning from the university president all the way to the prime minister, there were Oromo elders who went to ask the release of the students that were expelled from the university. No one listened. At that time, Taaddala Gammachuu said, "Hinteenyu maalumatti teenya. Alam mangistaata bira deemna. Wanna gubaa'een jedhu dhageenya." And a few years ago, when the Oromo cause seemed hopeless because of divisions among Oromo political leaders, Hacaaluu Hundeessaa released this song. He said, "Waa'ee keenya yoo itti dhiisanii silaa naman dhiisu. Dubbii keenyatu akkan taane, maal godhu akkan taane, hojii faana gargar baane, oduu duwwaa taane jechuudha. Hojii faana gargar baane." Itti dhiifnee silaa gad hin teenye. Itti dhiifnee silaa gad hin geenye. Walii gallee yookaan alaa hin galle. And at the same time, he exposed the nature of the real enemy that the Oromo were confronting through a song that was structured in questions and answers format. And he was saying something like, "Dhaqee cinaachi koo yemmuu lafa gahu waan arrafuun se'a. Narrafee hin rafne jechuufis ciisa koorran jira. Maalumaafan ciisa maalarrafaa miti. Gaaffii deebii dhabdee na keessa marmaarti. Mee akkamin ta'ee waan ta'us dhabee rafee buluu yaadus yaada koon dadhabee. So he said, "Why am I not sleeping? I have a place to sleep, but I can't sleep." He asked the question. And then he gives the answer, saying, "Eenyuun gadi, kanatu na aarsa, maafan aaruu dida. An ergamuu malee ergachuun dadhabe, kanaafin rafuu dida." And then say, "Garaan koo rakkattee rakkina faarsiti, abjuu hiika dhabdee hooduma rakkatti, egaa hamma yoomitti gadadoon jiraatti." Xinnaa guddaa, listen to this one. Xinnaa guddaa caalee guddaatu xinnaate an kanaafan aada. Dubbii isaan na dhibe, deebisaan dadhabee an kanaafan rafuu dida. He's answering the question. That's what it is. And then xinnaa guddaa caalee guddaatu xinnaate an kanaafan aadaa dubbii isaan na dhibee dubbii isaafan dhabee kanaafan rafuu didaa. And he answers it. Well, until when? It said gadadoon jiraanna hamma yoomitti. That's what he's saying. And between the 2014 and 2015, you have heard this one too, Afandi CEO released an album in which he consoles the dejected Oromo because of the violence of 2014. He say, Ya sabako, abshir nibariti. Ya lammiko, abshir nibariti. Laf barisa, dukkanni hammati, abshir nibariti. Of course, the darkness that you see today, yeah, it's the darkness before morning. It's the darkness before morning. But if anybody was able to pay any attention to the images that were even portrayed, you would really see how culture was used by the young generation to mobilize, in which I will give you only one stanza where he says, Machafi tulama, qabsoota afran qallo, jimmaaf boorana, sabboontota walloo, arsii wallaggaa hararii fi baalee, takkummaa jabeessa waliin tahaa golee. And then in the image, he gives his gun, handgun, to his son who had been beaten up, and his mother gives him something, food, and he sends him off. He says, "Go and fight, go and fight." His sister, who was helping him, in the image, his sister, she goes. The parents are not saying you go to and fight. But she goes through the back door and joins her brother, and they go off to fight. And if anybody looks at that, and the artists were not mobilizing the people, you're not looking. So that is how their contribution is. The message is clear. And of course, I go back to Hachalu regarding the master plan itself. Hachalu's song, Malan Jira, where he says, Gullallen kanenyu, Gullallen kantufa, Gara bichuturi, Galan finfinne marse. It's not yours. It's always been Galan's. Around Finfinne, it's been the Galan Gosa. He says that and say, Sila akka jaalala walirraan fagaannu jaratu nu fageesse. Diiganii gaara sana gaara diigamuun mallee nu baasan addaan baane nu addaan bahuun mallee. Sooretti haadha sooree erbaan irra buusa qabaayi seeqanii sesseeqanii kan garnu maase jarayi. My point is this. There is a lot of forces that contributed to the protest movement. But the artists have a place. In my paper itself, I will write a lot more and in detail about this. But I'm just giving you how Oromos retreated into culture to organize themselves, to transmit the message, organize themselves. Now, a lot could be said, but this is one way that the protest started, and they're really deeply rooted in. I know it's time. I have to stop. Maybe something about the interpretation. What should we make of it? This is a regime crisis. It's a crisis of the regime that had now deteriorated to a security crisis, that had now deteriorated to a governance crisis, a constitutional crisis. Now, who will act? I don't know. Who is ready? A military is ready. There is a military that is highly politically connected, that is heavily armed, and that is economically powerful. Now, would the military side with the people, as in the case of Egypt? That's doubtful. Would they side with the ruling oligarchy? That's a dead end. Either way, it doesn't seem they're going to win.